There are four types of trade distortions or trade barriers that impact price. They are import curtailments, there are import tariffs and quotas, export expansion or export subsidy, also import expansion or import subsidy, and export curtailments, export taxes and quotas. Import curtailments and export expansions are meant to support the domestic producer prices. The import expansion and export curtailments are meant to lower domestic prices to assist consumers. Typically, the first two are used, so import tariffs and quotas and export subsidies are used more often than the other ones. When talking about trade barriers, it's important to distinguish between a small country versus a large country. A small country typically does not affect the world price. That's because a small country's imports are not large enough to affect the world price. A large country typically affects the world price. It's because its imports and exports will have an impact on the world price. It's because they constitute a large fraction of the world trade. A tariff is a tax levied by governments on the price of imported products. It's done to protect the domestic industry or the domestic producers, but it comes with its problems. There are deadweight losses having to do with the tariffs. It creates distortions within the country because of higher domestic prices, and the costs imposed in other countries is done via lost export sales and lower world prices. An export subsidy is a subsidy granted by government to producers who ship their products to foreign markets. It's also called a negative tax. Often it is done as direct payments to producers, as export loans, or some other forms of tax benefits. Export subsidies have been implemented for years in developed countries to support exports of farm products. It is done again to protect or incentivize domestic producers. They hurt domestic consumers and foreign producers, but they benefit the domestic producers and foreign consumers. The overall effect is still the deadweight loss. An import quota is a limit on the quantity of a good that can be produced abroad and sold domestically. It's different from an import tariff in the way that it is not a tax on the price, it is actually a quota or a limit on the quantity of a good instead of price. It comes with the same issues as the import tariffs. One difference from import tariffs is that the government does not collect revenue from a quota, just the way it does with the import tariffs. Somebody does collect the revenue though. Quota rent or revenue from the quota goes to foreign producers for limiting their sort of exports into the country. You can think about a quota in the form of stickers that go onto every unit of a product, and only the product with the stickers can actually be imported into the country, whereas the other ones cannot. The stickers represent the license to trade with this country. One example of an import quota was sugar. Due to import quotas, U.S. sugar prices are 3 to 4 times the world price. These distortions were so large that it was profitable to produce high fructose corn syrup, which is actually a costly substitute for sugar, and to extract sugar from imported processed goods that contain sugar, such as cakes and pancake mixes. It's possible that import quotas were also placed on these processed goods that contain sugar in 1985 as a result of that. Another type of a quota is a voluntary export restraint, VER. These are trade quotas or limits imposed by an exporting country, usually at the request of an importing country. Voluntary in this case means that producers in the foreign country are asked to voluntarily reduce shipments to the importing country. In practice, they have a choice between voluntary restraint and potential barriers that would be imposed by the importing country, such as tariffs and import quotas. Why are VERs preferred to tariffs? First, producers in the exporting country capture quota rents. They earn the revenue from the quotas. A second reason is that this is usually an agreement between two producers in their countries. So a VER is typically more flexible than a tariff. One example of a VER was US-Japan automobile VER program in the early 80s that ended in 1994. Initially, it was meant to restrict Japanese exports of cars to the United States. VERs are discriminatory by design. That is because other exporters are not subject to agreements like that. For example, when the VER was negotiated with Japanese automakers, it did not limit imports from other countries. For example, countries of Europe. As a result, the demand for third-party or European imports increased. So let's go over the effects of these alternative trade policies and summarize them. We can have an import tariff, an export subsidy, an import quota, or a voluntary export restraint. With an import tariff, producer surplus always increases, consumer surplus falls, and the government revenue increases. But the overall national welfare is either a loss or a gain. So if it's a large country, it's ambiguous. It could be a loss, it could be a gain. If it's a small country, it will always be a loss. When we talk about the export subsidy, again, it increases producer surplus, consumer surplus invariably falls, and the government revenue also falls because government spends on these export subsidies but does not gain anything. And the overall national welfare also falls invariably. Import quota has kind of similar effects on consumer and producer surplus. While producer surplus increases, consumer surplus falls. The government revenue with an import quota sees no change because it doesn't collect revenue from the quota. The revenue goes to the foreign producers or license holders. The overall national welfare in the case of a quota is ambiguous for a large country, but always falls for a small country. And then there's voluntary export restraint, which increases the producer surplus inside the country, reduces the consumer surplus. So it basically is the request of the country to foreign producers to voluntarily reduce their exports. So the imports in the country fall. The government revenue sees no change because foreign producers see rents from this export restraint, but the overall national welfare falls. So you may notice certain patterns here. All of these trade policies are meant to protect producers because in all of these cases, if we look at producer surplus, it increases in all of these cases. But when we look at consumer surplus, it falls in all of these cases. And what about national welfare? National welfare falls in almost all cases, except for a tariff and an import quota when it is a large country, where there may be some social gains, but there also may be losses. So overall, consumers always suffer from these trade policies, producers benefit, and overall, producers typically benefit less than the suffering that is imposed on the consumers.